But thank you so much for joining. We have 4 esteemed panelists with us, and our very own Professor Cunningham, who's an assistant professor of strategy and entrepreneurship, joining us today to moderate the talk. What I can do is I would to just keep it very brief and fast. I can just start with a brief introduction of our moderator, Professor Cunningham, and it would be super great if all the panelists could give us a brief introduction, and then we could take it from there. Yes? Okay, just one second.
Sounds like a great plan.
Thank you. Professor Colleen Cunningham is an assistant professor of strategy and entrepreneurship at London Business School. Professor Cunningham's research examines the path to market for new-to-world inventions and antecedents and the consequences of different commercialization strategies and the anti-competitive motivations of technology acquisitions, with a particular focus in medical devices and pharmaceuticals. Prior to academia, Professor Cunningham researched health system management and policies, drafting advisory reports for various stakeholders and including health system managers. I would now hand it over to the panelists to give a brief introduction, and the stage is all yours then.
Good. So my name is Carol Wozniak. I'm managing director for CINT, which is a digital innovation firm. I'm based in London. I'm a Sloan 2019. I've been working with pharmaceutical companies and health systems for almost 15 years now. Being an executive in large corporations such as Johnson & Johnson, Roche, or Sanofi, or as a consultant in boutique firms such as CINT. I'm very glad to join the panel today, and I'll be talking about decentralized clinical trials and how we can innovate from bench to bedside.
Maybe, Tal, do you want to go next?
Yeah, hi, my name is Tal. I'm a GP. I work in a GP practice in West London, and which is part of the NHS, and I've done some work with doing some digital work in the NHS as well.
Reg?
Yes, hi. Good morning, everyone. I'm Rajiv. I work in what is the specialized area. It's called rare diseases or orphan diseases, and I've been doing work as a principal scientist, head of AAV gene therapy and biomarine pharmaceuticals.
Great. And then Ash, do you want to just give a brief intro to yourself?
Sure. Hi, my name is Ash. I'm a venture capitalist from Optum Ventures, which is a US venture capital fund specializing in healthcare IT and digital health investments. I'm a physician by training. I ran product R&D as part of the early team at Babylon Health, which went on to become a UK-based unicorn in healthcare. And I spent the last few years as a fund manager.
Great, thanks so much. So maybe I'll just do a little brief intro to the topic of the panel, and then we'll get going with questions, if that's okay with everyone. So today the topic is personalized medicine, or maybe you'd call it patient centricity, this sort of general topic. It involves tailoring medical treatment to patients, typically using their genetic profile. And it involves more personalized or tailored ways of screening, preventing, diagnosing, treating, or curing patients. It promises more effective, safer, quicker healthcare, avoiding the trial and error processes associated with the sort of more traditional one-size-fits-all approaches. Correspondingly, investment in personalized medicine has grown significantly over the past decade. For instance, in 2018, 42% of all of the new drugs approved in the FDA by the US FDA were personalized medicine, personalized treatments. So big growth, but there are also significant challenges associated with this. Treatment costs might be one, insurance coverage another, and those are just sort of a couple examples of the challenges involved. And I think we have a really great set of panelists here to dig into this topic, both where we are now and also where we're heading. This includes those themes that the panelist mentions, like decentralized trial design, the use of electronic health records and other tools to identify and stratify patients, how rare orphan diseases intersect with personalized medicine, and the state of NHS care personalization, and other themes. So why don't we start? So the first question is to all panelists. And I'll just preface before we start with the questions that if the attendees have questions that come up for the panel during our talk, just enter them in the Q&A function, and we'll have some time at the end to get to hopefully most of those questions, but it depends on how many questions there are. So the first question, the shift towards personalized medicine or patient centricity is taking shape in many different forms across different parts of the healthcare chain. So maybe you can just speak about what does this personalized medicine or patient centricity mean for your organization or the organizations that you work with, and what are the key challenges that you see? I'm going to start with Tal first.
Thank you very much. I think there has been a huge change in the way that we see patients, actually. So traditionally we would put patients into disease buckets. So you'd have diabetes, asthma, epilepsy, and actually now the technology is allowing us to be able to drill down a little bit more and to find out more about the person, and perhaps sort of tailoring some of the things that they want, rather than something that is kind of easy for us to do at scale. And I think Professor Mercedes, who's a professor of strategy at LBS, has got a brilliant model, which is quite simple, so I even understand it. So it's just the who, what, how. And so I don't mean to offend him. It's not just. I didn't mean to say just. It's a very.
I teach it too. I say just too. Yeah.
It's really powerful. So the who, actually, we're not looking at diabetes, epilepsy, and all the rest of it, which is convenient for us. We're looking at who is the person. Actually, maybe we should group people according to the CQC, which is the regulatory bodies guidelines, where we put working people together because they've got different needs, or people who are vulnerable, or people who are elderly. They might have different sets of needs and illnesses rather than things like diabetes. And increasingly, the NHS is starting to use something like patient activation measures, which the idea is to understand. It's a validated tool. NHS has bought lots of licenses, and it's a validated tool to help you understand where the patient is in their change journey, and then helping to put in the right sort of things to help patients deliver that change. So we're only with patients for a relatively short period of time, and actually we need to think about what happens before and after, and look wider than just drugs and therapeutics. And actually maybe healthcare should be focusing on wellness rather than illness. And the last thing is kind of how do we do that? So actually that's quite kind of powerful. So we did a survey in our practice, and we've got about 13,000 patients, and 2,000 patients responded as asking when the coronavirus started, and they talked about how they would like to engage with us. And actually it doesn't have to be kind of futuristic 3D printing and sort of really clever stuff. Actually, they just want things like WhatsApp and Facebook and Twitter and things. And actually, so we've gone about looking at how we can work with patients, on their own platforms rather than kind of inventing new ones, which are ours. And also the language. I think the language is different. A lot of professions hide behind professional quotes or phrases, and it's a barrier really to kind of make ourselves feel important or knowledgeable or something. Actually, maybe if we dumb down the language a little bit, maybe if we explain it in simple terms, it can result in a better outcome. So I think that the whole of healthcare is starting to change towards people rather than what people want and patients want, rather than what suits the clinicians or healthcare providers.
Great. Yeah, great. Carolina?
Sure. So, I want to stick a bit to my topic because I think it's very relevant, especially when you think about life sciences companies that, their innovation model is the development of new products. So I think when we're talking about patient centricity or personalized medicine and personalized delivery, if you think about the lack of understanding of the journeys patients go through. And I think that there's a lot of need. And I agree with Tal when he says that, it can be simple stuff that make all the difference. So a recent research I read says that 40% of the life sciences companies that run clinical trials don't understand the journeys of the patients, and they are not able to map digital touch points. So as Tal was saying, sometimes WhatsApp might be the best way to get in touch with the patients, especially during COVID times. If you're running a decentralized clinical trials, because either patients can go to the hospital or because they have to self-isolate, it is important to understand how to reach the patient in a personalized way. Not the way that maybe is the best for the practice or for the hospital or the study center, but for the patient. And one thing I find it interesting is just another research says that only 33% of the patients know and are aware of the clinical trials they could be part of. And I think patient centricity starts by understanding better who is your target as a person, and not only by a disease. So where does this patient lives? How can I get better connection with them? What are the hurdles, right? So a lot of patients don't go into clinical trials because they can't afford the travel. And why is that they can't afford the travel? Well, maybe it's because they live in a remote place, or because they don't have someone to leave their child while they are in the trial. So my invitations here is for us to think about patient centricity in a way that is holistic and considers the human being that we are relating to.
So perhaps it might be less about personalized medicine as treatment, but personalized medicine as care.
Yeah, not only about care, but as Tal was saying, we are not only talking about the disease. We are trying to understand how we can, for instance, keep patients on board of the study, or is our protocol good for them to be adherent or not, right? So we have to map the pain points of the relationship and the process we want them to engage. So we can get diabetic patients, for instance, with better outcomes. We can get clinical trials for specific cancer types easier to go through. That's what is my invitation.
Mm-hmm. Great. So how about I go to Ash now for a brief intro?
So I think this is really interesting. So like if I look at my phone and I look at Spotify, which is my music provider, they are able to classify me into 6 different personas. There's a little bit of Macklemore, there's some Mumford & Sons, there's some Ed Sheeran. They can see that there are, broadly speaking, 6 different genres of music I listen to for a period of a week, right? And they're not doing it for fun. They're doing it because they realize that they'll get better user engagement with me if they can supply me with a different type of playlist for the different persona I have at that point in time. They bothered to understand me on that granular detail. And that means that they get engagement rates in the mid-90s for people who use their apps. Now I flip that over and look at stuff like new oncology products and pharmaceutical products coming through the market. I always find it fascinating that the real world evidence that you see of actual patient performance in the market is different to what you see in the clinical trials. Mm-hmm. And what that means in reality is, and it's an unfortunate, uncomfortable truth, is that the clinical trials generalize and aggregate patients to a point whereby they no longer reflect fully the actual population those products are going to go on and serve. And if that was a digital product, you'd say it sucked. There's no two ways about it. So I actually think for me, personalization is about understanding that your patients are a multivariate individual. They're not just one thing. They're not just a diabetic. They're not just a 40-year-old woman. They're not just an Indian guy. They have multiple dimensions to them. And those dimensions matter because they your product works or doesn't work. And that applies just to Spotify as it does to a new CAR T therapy. So I'm really interested in technologies which enable researchers, clinicians, all of the stakeholders to understand people as multivariate objects as opposed to just single variate objects. So what are the different characteristics of people? Why might we think that one drug might work with one patient population but not another, or with one individual but not another? And I think if you can do that, you stand a better chance of bringing real world evidence closer to the theoretical evidence of clinical trials published. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, great points. And we'll come back to that, I think, with another question. Rajiv, do you want to do a description? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, I've been in rare diseases, orphan diseases, and the definition is actually fairly well defined by regulatory authorities. So, in the US, it's basically less than patients who are 1 in 2,000. In the EU, it's 1 in 10,000. I think, don't quote me on the number. I think that's what the numbers are. But the idea is that these are really rare diseases, and in some cases, you have 10,000 patients worldwide. That's how rare they are. And so a lot of these rare diseases, they're based on, you have genetic mutations that cause these rare diseases. And so we are starting from a point where we actually know what we need to replace. And so, you're not going through the traditional sort of finding a drug target and things like that. And in a way, because you know the genetic makeup, you know what you're trying to replace, it's an ultimate personalized medicine. That's, rare disease, orphan disease drug development can be considered as, a way of delivering personalized medicine to these patients. So it's a different perspective from, if you're treating heart disease, or let's say if you're treating oncology patients, you have a drug, and then you find out who are responding or non-responding, and then you find the genetic makeup, and you find, oh, this genetic mutation is why these patients are responding better than. In case of rare orphan diseases, you already know that from the beginning. And so it's the drug development and even a patient journey is completely different. You're engaging with the patients right off the bat in the beginning. So that's my short intro, I would say.
Sure. Yeah. Great. So I'm going to pick up on one theme that I think came out of all of the introductions, which was about the tools, whether they be technological or otherwise, that are facilitating our ability to target treatment care towards patients. So I guess a broad question to everyone is, can you talk about some of the ways that technology or other types of tools are enabling patients in your sectors or through your experience? So some examples of cases where you've seen this be very successful, perhaps some examples of failure if you've seen that as well, so we can get some understanding of how can we better understand this patient journey. And maybe I'll start with you, Ash, this time.
So there are a number of different touch points which you can use, I think, to improve the patient journey. So number one is around access. And so telemedicine providers have become, especially in the last 3 months, where you can't go to the doctor or the therapist's office anymore, have become extremely popular. And I think it's shown that patients are willing to engage with digital tools in a way that perhaps medical orthodoxy thought they wouldn't do only 3 or 6 months previously. It's now real. 6 months ago, everyone was still saying it was not real, but it is now, right? We've got companies in our portfolio that are doing stuff like that, and honestly, these guys the demand is just skyrocketed for what they're doing. When you step away from access, which is probably the easiest problem to solve with regard to telemedicine, because we're doing Zoom now, and so really the technology is quite vanilla. And then you think about stratification. So we know that if we find the right patient, we can get to them. We've solved the get to them problem. Now let's look at the find the right patient problem. I think that is a new frontier of technological challenges, and there's lots of different ways of looking at that. And some of that is biological, by looking at genomic screening, performing blood test analysis, looking for biomarkers in the serum and so on. Some of it is analytical, looking at medical records and looking for just kind of things that connect patients together, even though they're not seemingly obvious, be it responses to drugs, be it comorbidities, be it environmental factors you can record through those. And we're really interested now, and we're seeing what's working really well, is companies that can capture more information about people on a granular level that is later able to be analyzed by someone looking for a trend. So we've recently invested in a mental health business called Hallmask, which has an electronic health record that allows psychiatrists and therapists to capture really granular details about patients, so that you can try and see why is it that only 1 in 3 psychiatric drugs work the first time you try them, and see if we can improve the rate at which patients respond to these therapies. That's incredibly powerful data, but it requires a wholesale restructuring of the information that's being gathered, and a commitment from the get-go that if we capture better information up front, we can deliver better outcomes having done the work later. but you have to put the infrastructure in place first. So I still feel that the industry is at, like, we're still in the picks and shovels mode of industry building. We still need to get the infrastructure in place before we start talking about that version 2.0 of products that are going to come from that.
And when you say infrastructure, are you thinking like the availability of data, the collection of data, the analysis of data, all of the above, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, look, right now we see a lot of people who think of like petroleum, right? You can go to the petrol station, the gas station, and people will sell you unleaded, and next to unleaded, there's always this premium unleaded stuff, right? And that's got like special stuff in it that makes it better than the original version. And that is, if you think about it, that is such a high-end product. Think of the value chain that must have been built before someone thought, let me sprinkle in some special sauce to make the unleaded super unleaded, right? So we're still at the stage where we've discovered an oil refinery. We need to figure out how we refine those products. We need to show that those products work in the equivalent of cars, i.e. in our patients. And then you can talk about refinements on top of that. But that first 3 steps is still not widely available. I mean, in the US, there's been great work getting electronic health records into provider systems, and that was federally mandated. In the UK, I mean, I occasionally still practice as an anaesthetist. Loads of hospitals still run on pen and paper, which means that data is not being gathered anywhere. And I find that fascinating. So if we're going to talk about using analytics to build next generation businesses, we've got to first of all build the equivalent of the oil refinery. And I think that is the first building block in this industry. But the good news is that it's a 60, 100-year industry life cycle. Like, you guys are all MBA grads, you know way more about this than I do, but these things happen in epic cycles that outlast our lifetimes, and we're just at the beginning of it, which I think is why it's terribly exciting.
Great. Maybe Tal, you can jump in here.
Yeah, I think Ash has picked up on lots of really good points. I think it's not a technology challenge, and it's not technology tools that we need to kind of look at. For me, I think it's just a question of copying and pasting or adapting models that are used. If, for example, models are used in other industries, then you know that you can have traction and that it works, and then you can it's sort of been tested already in a different environment. So it then means that there's less risk and there's increased chance of adoption. So I think it's all about people, actually, and nothing to do with technology. But we as a practice, Northwest London works together, and we were using Zoom and for communicating with each other, and then we were told that no, you have to use Microsoft Teams. So we switched across, and we were pretty good at Zoom, and we're pretty good at Teams now. So we're kind of tech agnostic. But I think what we need to do really is it's all about the people in delivering care. We need to believe that technology, is an ally, and it's something that can help support us. But also we need to have systems and employment support and training, and the whole system has to work. You can't just deploy a new IT system or just deploy telemedicine or all the rest of it. I don't think it's anything to do with technology. I think we need to make the case to the people providing care that actually there are benefits in this for you. It will make your life a bit easier. And I think this COVID-19 experience has actually been a revelation, and it has changed people's perception of what can work. Often in healthcare, we hide behind governance, right? So we say, oh, we can't do that. It's information governance. Well, actually, a lot of those rules have been relaxed, and there's some amazing sort of sharing and learning. And I don't think we'll ever go back to how we worked before. But I personally think, really, it's about, this is the chance for us to look at systems and processes and delivering, or, using the petroleum example, actually, looking at the whole process map of our refinery and identifying places which are valuable, and actually saying no to things that are not. And because patients are doing their online banking, they're doing their online shopping. We need to, then now they're starting to do online healthcare. Mm-hmm. We need to support them. We need to make that experience pleasant. We need to believe that we can handle it. I find it remarkable how, as a doctor, you say, You know, I do online shopping, online banking, and I come to work and I say, no, I'm sorry, we don't do that. You have to come and see me. You know, so I think it's changing, and I think it's good for me personally. I think just doing basic stuff like using Twitter and Facebook and all the rest of it is probably the place to start. And I think also, finally, I've been talking for too long, but finally, it's not really about illnesses. I think it's more about behavior now. We need to have a really good understanding of patients' behavior and how we can support that, and also clinicians' behavior and how we can support that. And tools, relatively common, ubiquitous tools like Facebook and Twitter and YouTube.
So you think, when you mention those social network sites and things like that, you're thinking like using the data from those sites
Correct.
to better understand how patients engage, not just using those as communication tools.
It's all the data behind that. Because if you look at other commercial organizations, that's how they're using that data. They're using that, you know what, you put out A/B testing, you do 2 different messages, and you look at the response of those messages, and you try to tailor the message that you send as a result, so you get better outcomes. And also going back to Ash's point about kind of, personalizing care. So that's the patient activation measure. So my opinion might be X right now, but actually tomorrow it might be, I might have a different playlist on my Spotify account. And so we need to be able to adapt to that. And those tools help us. They can help us to identify those changing patterns and behavior.
Carolina, did you want to chime in here?
Sure. So thinking about patient centricity and how there are a lot of moving pieces right now and things are changing. I was thinking about Genentech. 5 years ago, they were doing some experiments in decentralized clinical trials, and I saw them in a talk, and everything seemed so far away, right? And now it seems that it is the time to start experimenting even more. And I think we have an understanding, as Tal was saying, that, there were some things that were just blockers on our mind of way of working. There were, reasons, that they might not make sense anymore. So for instance, one thing that we can see is that a lot of things are moving into patients' home, the care through Zoom, but also, you can move the trial process to patients' home as well. So it doesn't mean that everything has to be full patient home-centric, right? But you can start understanding how you can mix different models. And I think that's what's going to be post-COVID. So we probably are looking into, some on-site patient visits with remote visits. So we really have to understand, when do you need the on-site visit? Or we can use healthcare facilities that are closer to patients' home. Right? So, okay, I need to get an MRI scan, so I will need to go somewhere, right? But maybe for Tao to getting my blood data or something that I know, maybe there's other ways to do so, right? And my pressure, whatever. So I think we are in a very important moment to alleviate some of the bottlenecks that we have been having in life sciences and healthcare. And I think now it's the time. And especially because, as Ash was saying, patients, they are people, they want a different experience. So if I can do Spotify, why can't I do this? Why can't I have this in health, right? So I think we have to think about how can we accelerate this whole process to deliver a better experience. And I was thinking about another example that is Patients Like Me. I like this example very much because it is a social network for patients regarding a specific condition they have. And they debate and they talk with each other about their treatment, about the clinical trials. So it is not doctor-centered, it is patient-centric. And I think there's also this huge change of power. And then maybe that's why it makes a little bit uncomfortable, right? So the care is also, the care and the reflection about health is much more today towards the patient herself or himself than it was in the past. And I think that's also good because, there can be a lot of benefits, like more engagement to a treatment. If I understand it's not imposed on me and I have a saying on it, I think that's very important. And I think there's different things we could do. For instance, technology can help us to recruit a more diverse pool of patients, right? And I think there's still a lot to do about it. And there are a lot of, we can also blame the regulatory agencies for a lot of things. Oh, they don't let the life sciences company talk to the patients to get them to do this and that. Or, you know, NHS has this protocol. But I think we are getting a lot of support from some regulatory agencies and healthcare systems to do new stuff, to try, right? And I think regarding Ash's point on data, I think collecting more data and reducing data collection costs is the way to go. I understand there is a part of the infrastructure, and I also understand there's a part it's not an infrastructure, it's about behavior.
Yeah.
It's about regulation.
Yeah. So maybe with that point about regulation, I can ask Raj to chime in a little bit as well, about just thinking about this technology, thinking about the broad question about, you know, tools and technologies that do enable or challenges of using those things. And then also maybe your thoughts on, does regulation limit this?
Yeah, so I guess let's start with the first question. I guess, does regulation limit it? I mean, you know, we are in healthcare industry extremely regulated, and especially when you are submitting drug applications and things like that. You know, you need to tick boxes in a way, and, you know, show them that you have completed these things. I think the biggest concern for regulatory agency is always going to be, is your drug safe? And can it be applied to patients? So that's, you know, one way of collecting data. In terms of, I mean, so just to give you an example of rare diseases and, you know, where we can use technology. So patients are fairly well organized in rare diseases because, you know, I mean, usually they have groups, they have social media. And so you can leverage that to not only find patients, but also find doctors who treat them, who specialize in treating patients like that. And, you know, to give you an example of thalassemia, I mean, thalassemia, you know, there are specific centers that treat thalassemia. The other thing that you want to understand is the progression of the disorder, progression of the disease. If a patient, once you identify them genetically, has the disorder, and they go from a place where to, you know, where they're manageable, within a year, if they go to a place where they're not going to be manageable, if your drug is not going to be useful, or it will not reverse any symptoms, that's a very different drug development than, say, a patient takes 5 years to go from one state to the other state. So that's an example where medical records help dramatically. And you know, in rare diseases, I mean, many of the times patients actually, you know, they are not mobile. They have severe mobility issues or severe health issues that prevents them from getting to the clinic. And so in that case, technology, I mean, it's starting to come more and more into play, where technology is at home, where we can actually collect data, real-time data, everyday data, and real-world data to get real-world evidence. That's becoming more and more useful now, but it's quite nascent field, I feel. And part of it is also, you know, in terms of, if you collect the data from somebody's phone, can you submit it to a regulatory agency? And Apple, and you can see Apple and Samsung, you know, they have the Apple Watch. I mean, I don't have it, but I've heard, like, you know, it has these apps where they measure your EKG and things like that. And there's a regulatory component to that the data that is collected can be used, or is collected in a very specific manner that can be used for clinical trials and things like that. So that's a way where you are pairing a device and collecting data in a way that is going to be useful later on for regulatory submission. So I would say that, you know, that's where when they say companion diagnostic development and drug, you know, just test kits, those kind of components where you can collect data and be useful that's actually where I think the hurdle is right now, because it takes a long time. You have to be sure the data that he's collecting is informing you of your efficacy of a drug. Say, let's put it, simply, you're looking at efficacy of a drug. Does your data that he's collecting, is it informing you of that? Because it's really, for rare diseases, say, you have thalassemia, you have a mutation in beta hemoglobin gene, and you're collecting data on how good the patient feels, or what is their thrombotic risk. That's a little bit far removed. And so those kind of examples are where you have to make sure that the data that you're collecting is actually going to be useful for you.
And usable,
yeah.
I suppose.
Because it's always there, right? There's information overload, right? I mean, you can collect as much as you can. Can you narrow it down to something that's going to be useful?
Yeah. And I wonder also about the acceptability of such data from regulatory bodies. Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, Samsung and Apple, they are building these, these sort of healthcare devices, so to speak, that people use every day, but they also have components in them, or regulatory components or documentation in a way that can allow, they are approved in a way as medical devices for those specific things. Yeah.
So since we started a bit late, and I see one question in the Q&A, I'm just going to pose that question now just to stimulate a bit of things. So there's been a question for Tel and Ash specifically. Do you believe that personalized therapeutics will be more applicable to tertiary care, given how established and effective generic drugs are, and specifically from an economic perspective?
You can start with that, Ash. I'll fill in the gaps afterwards.
You're going to have a lot of filling in to do. Look, the tertiary care and primary care is an entirely artificial economic construct, right? And the reason I say that is because we set up primary care because all the data shows it's cheaper to run healthcare systems where you have a specialist acting as the gatekeeper to more specialized physicians further up in the hospitals. I mean, that's the bottom line. That's why we run primary care and specialty care. So from a patient perspective, I don't care whether it's my GP who prescribes it, whether it's my oncologist. If it's the most effective treatment that's going to make me better, I just want that particular treatment. And if the people part of this, the primary or the tertiary care element, is divided because the economics of frankly people power and the cost of human resources to have people at different levels of interaction, then I think that is an entirely artificial thing which could be done away with quite quickly. I would also suggest that generic drugs are probably very effective in certain areas, but if you compare the number needed to treat of one of Raj's orphan drugs, which the numbers needed to treat are like single digits, i.e. pretty much everyone who gets it benefits from it, I'm guessing, versus aspirin, an amazing drug for cardiovascular disease, you've got to treat 40 people before one of them gets better. Like, how do you feel being number 36 on that list? So my point is that primary care, tertiary care is almost an irrelevant construct. Generic drugs are good at some things, but they're not universally good for everyone. And that's the point of personalized care, that you can make drugs which work for every single patient every single time. And so I think the economics will work out because you can make people better at scale.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with. Obviously, there's a natural divide between primary and secondary care. Personally, I think there should be less of that. That still exists, and it's the gap between primary and secondary care is actually where there's significant risk. From an economic perspective, though, the drugs that Raj is working on are personalized, but they're very expensive, and they're also drugs that cure rather than treat. So, I that changes the entire model. In the UK, we have the NHS, which is, but in other countries, if you've got insurances that pay for it, then if I get the treatment for my drug from one insurance company and I go to a new insurance company, then actually my premium should be the same. There shouldn't be a premium to that. So it does cause problems as far as costs, and I'll be interested to see what Raj has got to say about how his medication is cost effective.
Raj?
Oh, Oh, you put me in a yes.
No
I'll
question,
say
Raj.
yeah. Rare disease drugs are expensive. I think it's just the economics of it. They're rare. They're expensive to make. It's not a traditional. And let us put it from a business perspective, right? You are developing a drug for a very specific disorder, for a genetic mutation, right? You cannot use that drug for anything else. I mean, let's give you an example of cancer drugs, right? If you have an antibody, you can treat it for prostate cancer, then you can try and see if it works for breast cancer and liver cancer and things like that. That kind of expansion is almost unheard of in rare diseases, especially like, let's say you're doing an enzyme replacement therapy. You are looking specifically at a patient who is missing that enzyme and you're replacing the enzyme into that patient. There's a finite number of patients in the world, and based on the birth rate, you can have, in addition to that population every year. But that's pretty much it. And so that changes the economics of the drug development. Costs are almost similar to developing a generic drug. And so that changes in terms of, how expensive it can get. But as what you said, they are really for unmet medical need and severe unmet medical need. And they are really curative in a sense that, dramatic curative in sense that, you can change mortality rates dramatically in patients like, if you don't get the drug. So I would.
So maybe a follow-up question on that is how, and it relates to another question that's in the Q&A, which is, how do you make the case for adopting these likely really expensive personalized medicine treatments, and more broadly, do you think that widespread adoption of personalized medicine would reduce costs significantly in the future?
So let's give you an example of thalassemia, right? You can have, depending on your mutation, you can have a mild thalassemia, a moderate, or a severe one. And if you have to do myeloablation, basically it's kind of like going through a cancer treatment, and you're repopulating your cells with something that makes functional hemoglobin. If you're a severe patient, you would probably want to go through that treatment because it will really give you an impact that you want. If you're a mild patient, you're like, I don't want to go through this trouble. And so that dictates to a certain extent how you price the drug and, what do you approve it in. The other part of this equation is, it's always a customer, who's going to pay for it. And that's where real world evidence, not just clinical trial evidence, which is, you're like, oh, I was able to reverse this biomarker. That's not enough anymore. Your real world evidence. And the difference between clinical trial and real world evidence is really, it's like, let's say a patient is 50 years old and you can reverse the biomarker, but the patient, let's say the drug is for a heart disorder, heart disease, but the patient also has kidney disease along with it, or high blood pressure. And so when you gather that real world evidence, sometimes you will see that the drug doesn't work as well in that patient who also has a kidney disorder or a kidney high blood pressure. And so if you go to an insurance company and say, I would like to get paid this much, they would want that real world evidence of how this would work. The second part is, I would say that it's a balance between how much you price the drug. The thing is also, you're also worried about competition, right? So there are some patent protections and things like that for rare diseases drugs. But at the same time, somebody could come in with a completely new technology. Just to give you an example, we had enzyme replacement therapies, or in case of hemophilia, we had infusions. And now people are doing gene therapy, which is just one treatment and done. And so that changes the economics as well. Mm-hmm. So you can read up more on, how gene therapy drugs are going to be priced. And I don't think people know that yet. Mm-hmm. how they will be priced. Mm-hmm. That's a real minefield in a way. Yeah.
Yeah. Great. So we have one additional question in the Q&A that I think is a good one. And it relates to the discussion we had about this sort of COVID-related, I think, rapid adoption of telemedicine, which is, the NHS is typically, their words, not mine, quite slow in adopting new technologies in their clinics. How do you explain how they've rapidly embraced these digital tech tools, and perhaps what we can learn from that going forward? That these barriers have been broken down, it seems. Is this a flash in the pan, or is this something that we can use to increase adoption in the future?
Yeah, I think we are definitely guilty of being dreadfully slow. And I think some of that is around the market that we're in, the risk averse, and in government, governance arrangements that are there ready, and about who takes on the liability and risk. And actually COVID has allowed people to kind of experiment and look at how that they could work. And actually beforehand, we had a massive workforce crisis. So you had rising demand, reducing supply, the workforce that were there were getting under a lot of pressure. And actually now, people have much more flexible working lives, and actually that can help support the workforce and deliver care in a better way for patients. And the question mentions, how do we use data? And actually, there is a lot of data. We have tons of data, but it's not really actionable. And I think actionable insights is the thing that you need to really look for. There's no point having a ton of stuff if it has no purpose or meaning, or you can't do anything with it. But the interesting thing is about personalization, I think, is the model hasn't worked, because it's fine to say, oh, here's a healthcare system and stick the patient in the middle. Now that's personalized care. That is not personalized care, because let's say primary care, we're just still working the way we work, and we just link into the patient every now and then. The hospital works the way they work, and they just link in the same way. I think we have to change the organizations, and we have to change the way that we see ourselves. We've got to start with us, and we've got to sell it to our staff, and we've got to sell it to, they say in aeroplanes, you've got to put your own mask on first before kids and stuff. So I think we as healthcare organizations need to think, look, we have a workforce crisis. How can we support our staff? How can we deliver higher standards of care, but also have a better working life? And I think COVID has revealed some interesting case studies. And I personally don't think we're ever going back, but I think we are going to go on to a much better, much more responsive, and much more personalized healthcare system after this.
Carolina, so you also talked a bit about the way that COVID has changed and made things, maybe the more decentralization possible. Maybe you can chime in here.
Sure, of course. So I think there is a key element of the discussion we haven't addressed. That is, we need a different approach to the system. So what happens is that everybody's trying to solve different bits and bytes of the equation, but we don't have someone orchestrating. I do understand here in the UK, NHS orchestrates the care in many ways in the national healthcare system. But if you think about the broader perspective of all the stakeholders involved, the pharmaceutical companies, the healthcare providers, the GPs, the patients, the nurses, the VCs, there's gotta be someone that tries to connect all the dots. And I don't have an answer to it. I wish I had, and if I had, maybe I was like a billionaire, right? But what I think is that we have to have an approach that it's not one size fits all. That was what Raj was talking about. So, if we have a personalized approach, we'll be able to reduce costs. If we reduce costs, it's gonna be, easier for pharmaceutical companies to provide access to drugs, for the NHS to, partner with technology companies to accelerate clinical trials or delivery. So I think my approach is the following. We have to improve patients' experience and access, right? And that goes about data, goes about how we can connect startups with life sciences and NHS more, because they have different speed. And I think that's something we have to think about. You can say, like, why don't the big guys go there and talk with the startup that is running fast? But this connection of them, it's different because there are different incentives and ways to work it doesn't make it easier to apply artificial intelligence to know some use cases. So maybe the patient right now is the one trying to orchestrate this system to get a better outcome. But, there has a lot of limits of information, of power, of access. So I don't know, maybe a service provider could, have an appropriate turnkey solution that would connect different stakeholders, kind of like an Alibaba in China trying to do this but I don't know. It's just, a provocation here. I wanted to try.
So a big challenge is, it's funny to have you suggest that a big challenge is almost the decentralization of it, that it's not coordinated.
Yeah. It is strange because when you approach decentralized clinical trials, what you see is there are different companies trying to solve each step of the way, but there are a lot of hurdles from when you go from one step to another. And also they don't interconnect. We have data problem, we have infrastructure problem, cost problems. So how to provide decentralized clinical trials in a organized ecosystem way? Maybe it's not about centralizing, but orchestrating the different pieces and bits.
So I'm mindful of the time here. We have gone a minute over when we said it would be over, but we had a bit of time at the beginning. So maybe what I'll do is, if the panelists don't mind, is just ask you to give a sort of 1 minute summary of some implementable steps that you think, or some sort of like the promising directions that you see in this, in personalized medicine in the future, and just take a minute or two. And then we'll conclude. So maybe I'll start with Raj.
Yeah, so what I would say is, I guess, I'm partial to rare diseases. I think they serve an unmet medical need. For us, the hurdles really are going to be gathering real world evidence. That doesn't put a burden on the patients. Quite simply, something where it makes it very easy for the patient to provide that kind of data. I think that's our biggest challenge at this time. And that's something that we'll have to solve, I think that's the biggest challenge, one of the challenges of rare disease drug development and reimbursement. Yeah, thank you.
Great, thanks. Maybe I'll go to Ash next.
So I think that progress in healthcare is a moral imperative as much as it's an economic one. And so it's whether we figure out the financing now or later, it's going to get figured out. And the reason I know that is because no one spends billions of dollars developing a drug and then does the market access and pricing on day 367 of the project. Like, if you're worried about how you're going to price it and sell it, you'd have done that on day one, and you wouldn't have spent the billions of dollars if you thought you couldn't do it. You know that, and I know that. So the fact that we do that anyway suggests that actually these are all solvable problems, and these are not reasons to not go ahead and do fantastic science which improves patient outcomes. That's point number one. Point number two is think about where the industry is just in terms of its life cycle. Like, I look at car manufacturing, look at petroleum, look at aviation, these industries that came and went and had their time, and they were massive engines of growth economically and in terms of human innovation for the time that they were around. I still think we're at the beginning of that process. We still got to figure out how do we get the fundamentals of the industry right. I think there is huge value to be created and, yes, captured by people and businesses that can help us to better understand patients and help to convert what are currently disparate, disconnected pieces of information into really good narratives and multivariate positions on what a patient really is. And there's a very bright future for super smarter people than me who can figure out how to do that.
Thanks, Ash. Tal?
Yeah, I think this, we just need to completely rethink how we deliver healthcare, and actually maybe it's about behavior, not just patients' behavior, but our behavior as well, and be able to quantify that.
Thank you. And Carolina?
Well, four key takeaways from my side. First, and very quickly, I believe the future of clinical trials is decentralized clinical trials for the reasons I've spoken on the panel. Second, I think the reason why we should modernize clinical trials is for us to develop novel products faster and in a more patient-centric way. So think about us needing an answer for COVID. How about if we could have had this answer in 2 months' time instead of being 2 months locked or 3 months locked and without an answer to it, right? And third one is, I invite everybody to think what patient-centric clinical trials could be. There are a lot of challenges we talked about, and I think each one of us that are different stakeholders in the system can do it's her or his part. And fourth thing is that let's navigate, through this changing landscape, and let's experiment, right? Let us not just keep thinking, oh, I wish it was different. I wish I could do something else. Let's do something quick and fast to learn more about how the future could be.
Great. Thanks so much. On behalf of the organizers, I just want to thank the panelists for joining us for this talk. I think I've learned a lot. I have a lot to think about in terms of personalized medicine, and we'll end it there. So thank you very much, panelists.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Happy to chat. If people want to connect by email, that's fine. The organizers can send the email out if they want. If people want to connect separately. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Same here. If you want to add me on LinkedIn, to continue the conversation, that would be great.